Hello, welcome to my presentation on Wittgenstein and the problem of other minds. We're going to look at the problem of other minds as it's generally formulated. This is an epistemological problem, and so we're going to look at some responses to that, which include the argument from analogy, the inference to best explanation, my preferred solutions, which is a common sense approach which stems from Moore's formulation of a solution to skepticism. We're going to look at some phenomenological approaches from Sartre, and looking at all that will help us understand why Wittgenstein saw fit to reframe the problem, what Soren Overgaard labels the no-problem approach. Then we'll have my response to Wittgenstein, questions, summary, and then some references. We're going to begin by looking at a formulation of the problem of other minds, as found in post-Cartesian philosophy. As Anita Avramides highlights, the Greeks apparently weren't very interested in this problem. It arises following Descartes' introduction of the cogito, my mind as a res cogitans, the thinking thing, outside of which lies a skeptical problem between me and my knowledge of the world. American philosopher John Pollock describes it as such. I witness a man hit by a truck. He is riding about on the pavement and screaming. The splintered ends of broken bones are protruding through his torn flesh and he is lying in a pool of blood. Being a philosopher, I ask myself, how do I know that he is in pain? Ludwig Wittgenstein has his own approach to this problem, using his beetle in a box analogy, the beetle being the concept we're trying to communicate to the world outside our boxed-in minds. I'm going to put this aside for a moment and come back to it because first I'd like to explain why he saw fit to tackle it and reformulate it. We can start by asking then, what is knowledge and what constitutes knowledge of other minds? Following Gettier, we can follow the path of most contemporary epistemologists and regard justified true belief as necessary but not sufficient for knowledge. We can sidestep the sufficiency question since non-sufficient traditional analysis is all that we need to formulate the problem. Let us agree that for any subject S and for any proposition P, S knows that P only if 1. P is true, 2. S believes that P, and 3. S's belief that P is epistemically justified. Given partial analysis, it follows that for someone to know that other beings have minds, it must be true that other beings have minds, she must believe that other beings have minds, and her belief that other beings have minds must be epistemically justified. However, the problem arises because it seems one can never be fully justified in ascribing mental states to others. While we can observe behaviour, we apparently cannot connect this, logically or perhaps even probabilistically, to mentality, so we are apparently left in a skeptical quandary. Putting the argument into a more analytic form, we can show that premise 1, I have direct access to my mental states. Premise 2, I have no direct access to the mental states of others. Premise 3, mental states can only be known by direct access, leads to a conclusion that I can never know that others have mental states that are similar to my own, nor that they have mental states at all. This is a paradoxical conclusion, as it leads to radical doubt. What we need to do then is attack one of the premises, or maybe even all of them, and then we can perhaps resolve the fact that the conclusion seems nonsensical. G.E. Moore offered a common sense approach to Cartesian doubt by raising his hand. Can we extend that?
Here is a hand, and here are some books on Wittgenstein and other minds. I definitely didn't write these.
It seems that this demonstration attacks the third premise that mental states can only be known by direct access. I can form a pretty good model of the activity that goes into writing these books. Artifacts that serve the purpose of bridging the gap between minds, and that model involves logical thinking and rational argumentation. That model must be similar to the mental state of what I do when I attempt to do the same. Nevertheless, I've not met any of the authors, so it could be the case that an AI neural network could have somehow generated them, and I could perhaps be deceived about whether they were written by a being with a mind. A commonly cited response to the skeptic is the argument from analogy. This extrapolates from our own case. If I cut myself and see that I am bleeding and it is painful, then when I see others bleeding and reporting pain, then I can analogically ascribe similar mind states to them. But how can one generalize one case so irresponsibly, Wittgenstein will say? What he's highlighting is the fact that we are making an inductive generalization from exactly one case, our own. This is the weakest possible instance of an inductive argument. However, we might respond and say that it is not an induction based on a single case, but on all those cases where I have observed a person in those states of behaviour and been able to judge that he was in pain. Yet the fact remains that we could be deceived. This seems to attack premise 2, but it isn't exactly direct access. More of a direct assumption that the texture or qual of my states must be the same, whatever that sameness is. However, the argument seems to beg the question. It starts with the assumption that you have a mind. It's also the case that individual minds across the human spectrum are very different. We wouldn't expect the mind of, say, Joseph Stalin and that of Greta Thunberg to work in the same way. So how can we say that they're the same thing? Another way of responding to the skeptic is what's called the inference to the best explanation. This is a probabilistic technique. For example, electrons are not directly observable, yet electrons offer the best explanation for the behavioural effects that one observes. Many scientific theories are influences to the best explanation, and probabilistic techniques, such as 5 sigma confidence, constitute what functions as a proof. Paul Churchland explains that a theory about something that is unobservable nonetheless can be belief-worthy if it allows us to explain and predict some domain of observable phenomena better than any other competing theory. So, positing the theory that you are minded in a way similar to me, it allows me to explain the things that you do. The guiding thought is that the mental states of human beings are what cause them to behave as they do. So the inference to their having minds is one based on that being the best explanation as to how they behave. So although I have no direct or telepathic access to you, by attributing certain mental states to you is justified because it allows me to explain things that happen better than other explanations. How about objections? Wittgenstein in the Philosophical Investigations suggests that my ability to attribute mental states to myself depends on my ability to attribute them to others. And there's a certain sense that our certainty about others is part of some form of life we inhabit, rather than something that would need to be theoretically justified in some sort of scientific type hypothesis. One of the contemporary issues with this approach comes from developmental psychology. Newborns do seem to understand other people without making any sort of inference to them being minded. They can imitate humans but not non-humans, and this suggests some sort of basic understanding of other minds is already present in our very earliest experiences. Research into mirror neurons also leads to a similar conclusion. However, we're philosophers, so let's look at some philosophers. Another approach develops out of phenomenology. Here are some of the classic phenomenologists, all influenced in one degree or another by Hegel. Basically, they suggest that attempts to justify knowledge of other minds through inferential reasoning somehow fails, or even radically fails, to capture what sort of connection we have with other people. They advocate for a view that we might call direct perception in some experiences of other people. Our best justification for claiming we know someone else's mental states is precisely their expression. There's no need for theorizing about that. The mind cannot be separated from the experience world in Husserl's conception. And as Merleau-Ponty points out, the anger shown in someone's fist is quite literally an expression of the anger. There's no need to separate it from any sort of mentality. The whole thing is a unity. Sartre agrees with the other phenomenologists that inference and theoretical means of knowing others are never going to capture the actual ontological connection we have with them. But what would capture it? What we need to find is some experience that has the experience of other people as a necessary condition. In Being and Nothingness, he gives, as part of a deeper Hegelian and Heideggerian analysis of intersubjectivity, his phenomenological account of shame. Shame, he says, in its primary structure is shame before somebody. So embedded in the experience of shame and being shamed includes as the necessary condition the existence of another. The scenario he gives to demonstrate this is that he asks you to imagine that you are peeping through a keyhole at something going on the other side of a door. You might be nervous initially, but over time you'd cease to be nervous because you'd become immersed in perception of what's happening behind the door. All of a sudden you hear footsteps. In that instant you'd feel objectified. There's no choice, you'd just be overwhelmed by a feeling, something like shame, that you exist as an object seen by another person. He calls this the look. In the look, we momentarily lose our subjectivity and experience ourselves as the object of another's judgment. Philosophically, something forces us to go from pre-reflectively peeping through the door, not really aware of ourselves, to suddenly feeling that we're a peeping Tom, an object for another person. This is only possible then if other people with other minds exist. You couldn't have this experience of being overwhelmed by a feeling of your own status as an object in front of chairs or other animals. The experience of being objectified in this manner presupposes another subject who is doing the objectifying. The other is exactly the being for whom I can appear as an object. So Sartre argues that the other, as other, is revealed to me through my awareness of myself as being an object for them. It's when I experience my own objectivity for and before a foreign subject that I have experiential evidence of another as subject. What we must ask then is whether we can generalize from this case of shame to other feelings and emotions, feelings that are less other object focused. And this is where Wittgenstein comes in, with his formulation of the problem. In the Philosophical Investigations, Wittgenstein rejects as an issue the skeptical problem as traditionally formulated. Soren Overgaard labels this the no-problem approach. According to Wittgenstein, philosophical problems are signs that we have become lost in the maze of our language. They are illnesses that we need to be cured of, not something to be solved. The traditional problem undergoes an important change in Wittgenstein's hands and becomes something more like the intersubjectivity issues discussed by the phenomenologists. He attempts to cure us from the temptation to raise such skeptical questions, and he does this by making the point that, at their core, our relations with one another are not based on knowledge at all, but based on something much more fundamental. Wittgenstein proposes liberating us from the Cartesian picture that is perennially limiting. He says, contrary to John Pollock, If I see someone writhing in pain with evident cause, I do not think all the same his feelings are hidden from me. It's just there plain to see. What he does suggest, though, is that the words themselves used in what he calls the language game are problematic, and that confusions in language are what creates the skeptical problem. This is where the beetle in the box example comes in. In comment 293 in the PI, Wittgenstein says, "If I say to myself that it is only from my own case that I know what the word pain means, must I not say the same of other people too? And how can I generalize one case so irresponsibly?" This is the comment on the argument from Allergy. So now someone tells me that he knows what pain is only from his own case. Suppose everyone had a box with something in it, we'll call it a beetle. This is like the head. No one can look into anyone else's box, and everyone says he knows what a beetle is only by looking at his beetle. Here it would be quite possible for everyone to have something quite different in his box. One might even imagine such a thing constantly changing. But suppose the word beetle had a use in these people's language. If so, it would not be used as the name of a thing. The thing in the box has no place in the language game at all, not even as a something, for the box might even be empty. No one can divide through the thing in the box, it cancels out whatever it is. That is to say, if we construe the grammar of the expression of sensation on the model of object and designation, the object drops out of consideration as irrelevant. One of the things he's saying here then is that when we use a word like pain for an internal happening, this exclusive access that we have of our own pain sensations that are like immediate, when we use that as in a public way, everyone has their own experience of pain as a sensation. So to use it as a thing, to sort of nounify it, is a mistake. The noun itself, the word, becomes meaningless. So we can reframe the problem in this way as what we might call Wittgenstein's conceptual problem. P1, the meaning of our mental concepts, pain, jealousy, etc., is fixed by reference to my own mental states. The conclusion is that we therefore cannot meaningfully attribute those mental concepts to others. Everyone's is different. As he says, the essential thing about private experience is that nobody knows whether other people also have this or that or something else. Wittgenstein's diagnosis is that we get into trouble when we apply the schema of object and name to subjectivity, and that this approach is the common mistake of Cartesianism and behaviorism. Subjective life is not an object, it's not a thing, nor is it a nothing. The presupposition that we may use concepts such as object, thing, state, and process to characterize subjectivity and subjective experience, this is what creates all our difficulties. He says, "It can't be said of me at all, except perhaps as a joke, that I know I am in pain. What is it supposed to mean, except perhaps that I am in pain?" He resists the terminology of knowledge when applied to the first-person perspective on such phenomena as pain, but to a certain extent sanctions it when it's applied to the third person. He rejects the conception that one's own subjectivity is something to be perceived, as if it were something I perceive at a certain internal distance, rather than what I am. Therefore, we should avoid construing the mental lives of others as something completely inner, cut off from the body and the surrounding world, Soren Overgaard highlights. The expression of joy or happiness you see in someone's face lit up by their conscious experiencing of the world shows transcendence without gaps. The expression itself is the direct presentation of the mental life of another. You do not have to look into yourself to recognize the fury in his face. It is there as clearly as your own breast, Wittgenstein says. We do not have to build epistemic bridges to reach other minds. We are living human beings. As such, this articulation is remarkably similar to the one we find in phenomenologists such as Husserl, Merleau-Ponty, and Heidegger. Our philosophical task then is to provide a surveyable, or, as he says, perspicuous presentation of how our being with others hangs together with what we are. As part of Wittgenstein's task to show the fly the way out of the fly bottle, to relieve philosophers of these problems, he highlights the fact that we are already situated in an intersubjective world, attuned to others as other minds, or more properly as other human beings, and since it's neither an opinion, nor a belief, nor something claiming the status of indubitable knowledge, this attunement to others, it's not vulnerable to attack from skeptical thought experiments. It comes before opinion, knowledge, doubt, and justification, and thus before the game the skeptic wants to play. If we reject the conceptual divide between mind and world, then, as Anita Avramides says, there are no bridges to be built in order to cross it. Questions that remain concern the pathology of the problem, the question of the form, what is it about human beings that makes them maintain an interpretation that sustains the threat of skepticism? As Heidegger says, we must indicate why Dasein, the human, as being in the world, has the tendency initially to bury the external world in nullity epistemologically before going on to resurrect it with proofs. It seems then we've been liberated from the problem. Wittgenstein and his fellows have restored us to sanity and the common sense intuition of our collective experience. We can now use the time as philosophers to do something else. I've written a response to Wittgenstein and it's available on the Google Sheet slides for this presentation, as I've run out of time to fully explain in detail what it is. To briefly summarise, what I think remains useful is his demonstration of the apparent meaningless of words such as love, and that it's up to us as philosophers to help everyone claw back some of the ground of meaning in their utterances. Given he's shown that this constitutes a language game that every player is obliged to play, but that we're all getting wrong, it's now up to us to help. How we're to do this, I'll leave in your hands. Do we have any questions? How about Matilda?
Isn't saying, well, I didn't write these books on other minds, but look, they exist, a bit of a swizz? Proofs in philosophy can't be that easy and straightforward.
That's a great question, and my response stems from G.E. Moore's common sense rejection to radical skepticism. I know that I have a rational sequential thought process that common language labels as reason, and that this can be employed in the intellectual pursuit of solving problems, such as whether I can know other minds. So it seems intuitively undeniable that the other people I see around me, and the philosophers who write books of scholarship, are utilising the same system. The living proof, so to speak, are the artefacts that exist outside of myself. And to say, well, we could be deceived about this, really says little and leads us nowhere. Wittgenstein was highlighting the fact that the problem of other minds is primarily the problem of other philosophers' minds. The everyday man on the street doesn't even regard this as a real problem worthy of investigation, and as I've shown, it's primarily caused by the introduction of radical skepticism into philosophy. And to really enter into it, to go there, is to get stuck in a mire. Perhaps nowadays the better question would be to ponder what types of other minds there might be, like those of animals or machines or even aliens, and how we'd tell they were minds, and what greater minds than ours could be like, and what language and logic they might conceivably use. Next question.
Aren't you going to mention the Zen answer? That our individual minds are part of the Buddha mind, but lost in a delusion of separateness, the ego labels the self. And that it's up to every philosopher to practice the realization of the true ground of being, and appreciate we are all one with the Buddha nature.
You're obviously extremely bright, Matilda. We've long since run out of time, so I can't go into as much detail as I'd like to answer your question, so I'm going to put a long answer on the Google Slides presentation. In essence, though, what I'd like to say is that you could be right. The philosophers of the Zen school have their own approach to the problem of other minds. This is called non-dualism, that, as you've highlighted, could be summarised by the thought that, at our core ground of being, which they find to be emptiness, our true self is revealed as the true self of all sentient beings, which they label as the Buddha nature. This is something a Hegelian might call the absolute idea. The fact that the I and the not I are the same thing. However, there's an ontological model baked into our predicated language of subject and object, and this is one of the things that keeps us from realising this idea. How that sits with what we've considered today is that the young Wittgenstein's concluding proposition in his Tractatus was, whereof we cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. His finding that metaphysical propositions also become meaningless if they can't be reduced to simple empirical language. Yet this silence is the same silence that the Buddhists have been practicing with since before the time of Socrates. What they point towards is that your suffering is essentially your own, private, and that there are no easy words that anyone can say to you that will cure it as if by magic. There's no logical ladder to climb to enlightenment. So they suggest a daily practice, zazen or seated meditation, that you can use as the empty ground of being to both explore becoming and to begin to drop your attachments, the main attachment being the one you have to conceptual and discursive thought that they regard as an impediment to your realization of this Buddha nature. So where Wittgenstein rather autistically demands silence, the Mahayana Buddhists of the Zen tradition practically revel in it. Where he finds a shocking lack of meaning, they find the beginning of a shared ground of compassion for others. Zazen presents the neck-down solution to what manifests as neck-up problems, and I can really recommend it. Any more quick questions from anyone?
Do you think Wittgenstein and the development of the philosophy of language have ruined things for good?
I think you're trying to be a bit clever now and get me into a rant against analytic philosophy, so I'm going to follow Ludwig's advice and say nothing on this one.
Aren't you going to get marked down for solving problem 0 at the beginning?
No, I hope not. In addition to having just a bit of fun about my predicament, I was also demonstrating mimetically a view widespread in the philosophy of mind and cognitive neuroscience, that if we could somehow scan the box, then we could computationally extract the beetle. I feel the reality is going to be vastly more complicated, and that those involved are deeply mistaken. In summary, what I've tried to argue is that Wittgenstein attempts to free us from the limitations of perennial problems in philosophy. By focusing the debate onto language itself, he shows us that we are indeed limited in what can be usefully communicated to bridge the gap between minds which it seems intuitively obvious exist. However, to ascribe as meaningless our attempts at communication, I believe, is somewhat unfair. Yet we are in very problematic territory when nouning, defining as a thing, exclusive internal happenings such as pain or love, as we cannot ever truly share another's inner sensations and qualia. While the limits of my language are the limits of my world in the task of constructing logical academic arguments or writing books about complex metaphysical phenomena, this is not the only mode of communication open to me. The embrace of a lover or the sinking feeling when one is silently shamed or objectified by another communicate more than words ever can. The language game isn't merely a game played with particles of words. There is a wide gamut of other methods of synthesizing, abstracting, and expressing what is happening inside one's private world that may resonate with or expand another's interior landscape. Finally, during questions, I verbalize my favorite solution, that which develops out of non-dualism of subject and object. To me, it seems that the default ontological model baked into our predicated language is another impediment, and now Wittgenstein has compelled us to silence, we should grasp that silence and enjoy being inside of it, to practice sitting with it, and perhaps we might uncover that there is a wholly different mode of experiencing being one with the world, where the gap between minds and selves dissolves, and along with it dissolves the I and the thinking of the cogito itself. And just to recap, today we looked at the problem of other minds, we looked at the epistemological problem of other minds, my preferred solutions, which include the phenomenological account, and then we looked at Wittgenstein's conceptual problem of other minds, called the no-problem approach, my response, an anti-philosophical solution from Zen, and then a summary and references, which are these. Thank you for your time, and thanks for listening.